Hey everyone, my name is Aaron and welcome back to MindScience episode 9. In this video, I'd like to speak about a spiritual practice that can become the game-changing factor in your own self-realization, and one that I find gets commonly overlooked by most spiritual seekers. You'll be hard-pressed to find anyone on YouTube teaching about this topic because, frankly, it's just not sexy enough to get clicks like Law of Attraction or 5D reality transurfing. But if you're serious about finding freedom from suffering and happiness in daily living, then this is the direct path. In my experience, the number one most powerful and potent weapon that we have to dissolving the ego is forgiveness. You probably noticed that I didn't put the word forgiveness in the title or the thumbnail of this video, because whenever I make a video on forgiveness, hardly anyone clicks on it. Need I say more? That's because the ego hates forgiveness more than literally anything else. And so in this video, I'm going to show you why. Forgiveness is the ego's kryptonite, but it doesn't want you to realize that. So it does everything it can to get you to see forgiveness as not that important, fairly insignificant. Yeah, there's more important things to worry about. And as long as it can get you to believe that, then it will always maintain some level of power over you. Because the ego is the belief in separation. And so as long as there's anyone or anything in your life that you haven't yet forgiven, then in that area, the ego reigns supreme. But by the end of this video, you're going to be inspired to forgive everyone and everything in your life that you had been investing with guilt, because you will see that forgiveness offers everything that you want. But in order to help you understand why this is true, let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of the ego and why forgiveness is its ultimate undoing. The ego's program is the belief in separation, and so everything the ego does is ultimately a means to intensify this belief. The more separate you believe you are, the more control the ego has. Now, every animal in nature, predator or prey, knows how to get their food source. That is what evolution does best. And just like an animal in nature, the ego is a kind of psychological entity that evolution has created, which also knows how to get its food source. And the ego's food source is your attention. And over a few million years of evolution, the ego has developed some really crafty ways of getting it. So let's talk about how the ego has learned to do this. We can think of the body and the mind as two separate entities. The body is a biological organism that has been programmed to react to stimulus in certain ways to help keep us alive. We call this program of the body fight or flight. When the mind registers anything as a threat, a biological anger or fear arises to prepare the body to either fight off or escape from the attacker. And over millions of years, the ego has learned how to take advantage of this impulse. So it essentially piggybacks on the biological response, which in itself is completely neutral and impersonal. But the ego claims credit for it and assigns it a personal motive. The body doesn't know the difference between a threat which is real or imagined. It just responds the same way, regardless. And so the ego takes advantage of this fact by personalizing the emotion with thoughts. So the ego then creates a thought of personal blame towards the other for what they did, which causes the body to rehearse the event again and release the same emotion of anger. And this is uniquely human. You never see a herd of antelopes plotting revenge against a hyena who ate one of their offspring, because their fight or flight response is completely impersonal. But through the evolution of the human ego, our response has become very personal. And the word that we use to refer to this personal fight or flight response is guilt. Guilt is the ego's primary weapon because it triggers the biology's fight or flight response, which the ego then uses to capture our attention and enhance our belief in separation. So the ego's thought system is always a form of guilt. Fight says, you're guilty and I want to cause you pain. Flight says, I am guilty and I want to escape my pain. After a million or so years of evolution, the ego has learned that this method is basically a slam dunk guarantee that it's going to get your attention. Because a thought without emotion is easy to ignore. But a thought with emotion is almost impossible to ignore. And so whenever you feel any of the different forms of fear or of anger, that's actually just the body's biological response to a potential threat. Whether or not a real threat is actually there, the body doesn't know. But the ego then uses this emotion to create thoughts of guilt. Either you're guilty or I'm guilty. Fight or flight. And so in this way, the ego's survival depends entirely on the way that we respond to our emotions. Now, I want to give you the two universal laws of guilt. The first law is that all pain which is not healed must be offloaded somewhere. The body does not want to keep negative energy trapped inside because it's literally toxic to the body, so it is constantly seeking to offload it onto others. So all judgment is basically the attempt to make myself innocent by making you guilty. And the second law of guilt is that anyone who is willfully causing another person pain is only doing so to offload their own pain. And people who don't want to offload their pain onto others, for whatever reason, are then forced to offload it onto themselves through depression, self-loathing, substance abuse, or inflicting self-harm. But all pain must be offloaded somewhere, and there is no exception to this law. So these mechanisms that our mind creates to avoid pain or offload pain are what we call defense mechanisms. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on this right now because I've already made a video about this, which is literally titled Defense Mechanisms, which you can watch here. But the main idea is this. All conditioning is the impersonal result of what happens to us in life, and no one's in control of what happens to them. So all of our conditioning is not anyone's personal responsibility, but simply the product of the flow of life. Let me give you a tangible example of how defense mechanisms work. Now, I've been working as a full-time personal trainer for a little over 7 years now. And one of the things I've learned to spot pretty quickly in my clients are past injuries. So I can watch the way a client does an air squat, for example, and say, I bet you had a left knee injury a few years ago, don't you? And they say, wow, yeah, actually I tore my left ACL a couple of years back. How could you tell? And the way I could tell is because I know that the body always moves away from injury. It's part of the body's programming. So if I see that someone is hip shifting a lot to their right side, then it's most likely because they have an injury on their left side, and so their body is moving away from it. This is an automatic reaction from the body, and the person has no idea that they were actually doing it. Now, do I hold my client personally responsible for their dysfunctional movement pattern? Shame on you for moving like that. You ought to know better. No, of course not, because I recognize that it's not their fault. It's just the result of a previous injury that their body is trying to avoid re-injuring again. But likewise, anyone who is inflicting pain on another person is demonstrating that they have a dysfunctional movement pattern in their mind, which is the impersonal result of a previous trauma that they experienced. And so now their mind is trying to avoid re-injuring that part of their psyche again. They weren't responsible for what somebody did to them, and they weren't responsible for the defense mechanism that their mind created. They aren't even aware of it. But our ego wants us to hold them personally responsible for their actions, as if they had any real say in the matter. Because again, casting guilt is how the ego maintains control over us. And if they're guilty for their actions, then I'm guilty for mine. The way that you are right now is the result of your genetics and life conditioning, neither of which you have any control over. You didn't choose your parents or the genetics they passed down to you, and you didn't choose your life experiences. It is life that has conditioned you the way you are right now. And this is what is meant by the ancient Zen teaching that there is no personal doer of actions. It means that all of life is behind every action we take because every action we take is some form of conditioning. Our conditioning has been put in place by life. It is not our personal doing. And so guilt, from the universe's point of view, is meaningless. Obviously, if it were up to you, you would choose to be happy and at peace 24/7. But your genetics and life conditioning say otherwise. You could think of each person you meet as a puppet, but the hand behind the puppet is not a separate individual doer with total free will as the ego would have us believe. The hand behind the puppet is life. Every person has been shaped by a sequence of events that goes all the way back to the Big Bang. And although we like to believe we have total autonomous free will 24/7, the truth is that the roots of our biological conditioning go far deeper than any of us realize. So until a person heals their traumas, they literally don't have the free will or the self-awareness to behave otherwise. But the ego feeds us this totally delusional idea that they should have known better. They should have made a better decision. And because they didn't, I pronounce them guilty. But of course, this is a form of insanity. It's a complete denial of reality. That person couldn't have known better. They couldn't have made a better decision. How do we know? Because they didn't. That's reality. So if you say that someone should or shouldn't have done what they did, you are denying reality. It's important to realize that the person who hurt you was a part of a domino effect of somebody who had hurt them, who was hurt by somebody else before that, and so on. Nobody makes it out of this life without experiencing deep psychological pain at the hands of others. You could search forever to try and find the reason why someone did what they did until you eventually arrive at the Big Bang. There is no one who is personally responsible for your pain. It's a sequence of cause and effect where you can always shift the blame to someone else. You could think of people like chemicals. Every chemical is designed and programmed to react a certain way to each chemical. Every chemical reaction is essentially predetermined. And likewise, every human interaction is also predetermined by the genetics and conditioning of each person. But the ego wants us to believe that everyone's reactions to us are personal, and therefore, guilt and blame must be cast. And so this insane cycle of guilt and blame will just continue down the domino line until someone finally decides to break the cycle. So forgiveness is the voice of reason that breaks the cycle of guilt and blame that the ego had created. Forgiveness kills the ego because it removes the hooks of guilt the ego had placed upon us. And this is because no idea ever leaves its source. Meaning, if you see guilt in another person, that's because you saw it in yourself first. But likewise, if you refuse to see guilt in anyone else, then you will not find it within yourself either. But the ego tells us that forgiving is weakness, because it means that we are accepting that what they did to us was right. Like, hey man, I forgive you. 'Cause fuck me, right? It's all good, bro. But forgiveness is in fact the exact opposite. It is the greatest act of power because it is saying that I am too valuable to be hurt by you. It doesn't even accept the attack as being real to begin with, because it sees that this person is just trying to offload their pain, and that's not a reflection on who I am. No one can ever attack who I truly am. So why would I disempower myself by believing that I am your victim? When we read the story of Christ being nailed to the cross and crying out, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do," nobody reads that story and goes, he should have gone kicking and screaming to his death. That would have been super badass. We all recognize that Jesus forgiving his murderers while they were murdering him was the greatest act of power he could have demonstrated in that moment. What he was also saying was, sure, you can take my body, but you cannot take my inner freedom. Forgiveness awakens us to reality, teaching us that the past is over, and it offers us nothing that we want. But forgiveness offers me everything, because it removes my pain and exposes my eternal value. But you will only be able to see your true value when you come to the place where all you want for your fellow man is peace. And at that point, the peace that you give to the world becomes your own. And that is the power of forgiveness.